I did not know it yet, but my $3.6 million had already turned me into a ghost. The night I discovered my in-laws celebrating without me, drinking champagne I unknowingly paid for, was the same night I realized my place in their family had never been real at all. Christmas Eve in Charlotte should have felt warm in its own way, even with the cold wind crawling across the empty parking lot of the gas station. But that night, I felt nothing but the ache in my legs after a 10-hour shift and the weight of exhaustion in my chest. I locked up the small repair bay, tossed my gloves into the toolbox, and hoped that Rachel might at least call to ask when I would be home. There was nothing. My phone had been silent all day, and somehow that silence felt louder than the traffic rolling down Central Avenue. When I walked into our small townhouse, the place looked darker than usual. No smell of dinner, no soft music, no sign Rachel had even been there. I sat down, rubbed my hands across my face, and tried to shake off the long day. I thought about calling her, but something in me hesitated. I told myself she was busy with holiday clients in Richmond. Makeup jobs always got hectic this time of year. At least that was the excuse she had given. The vibration of my phone startled me. I reached for it expecting a quick message from Rachel. Instead, the notification was from a live stream platform. The username hit me instantly. Tyler Whitmore, my brother-in-law, the same one who filmed everything he did as if the world cared. I opened the stream because curiosity was always my weakness. The screen lit up with bright golden lights and loud laughter. For a moment I could not even process what I was looking at. The Whitmore family villa in Richmond stood behind the crowd like something you would see in a real estate magazine. A giant Christmas tree towered over a long table of food so perfect it looked staged. People lifted glasses filled with champagne that probably cost more than my entire monthly pay. Tyler swung the camera around and bragged about the Whitmore year-end celebration. My stomach tightened. Year-end celebration? I waited for Tyler to mention me or Rachel. He did not. It was as if I did not exist. Then the camera settled on the last person I expected to see. Rachel, my wife. Her red dress shimmered under the lights. Her hair was done in loose waves I had not seen in months. Her face glowed with careful makeup, the kind of effort she never bothered with at home anymore. She lifted a glass, laughing with friends and cousins, completely at ease, completely joyful, completely without me. A strange stillness took over my body. Not anger, not confusion, something colder than both. I waited for the moment she would look at her phone or ask someone where I was. But she did not. She looked as if she belonged to that world entirely. As if the husband she had left in Charlotte had never been a part of her life at all. I replayed the last few weeks in my head. The shorter conversations, the sudden weekend trips to Richmond, the way she talked about image and opportunity, the way she said, "Logan, you would not enjoy these parties anyway." At the time, it felt dismissive. Now it felt deliberate. Tyler moved the camera again, showing a banner on the far wall. Whitmore Partnership Celebration. My heart lurched. That was not the name they used for their boutiques. Partnership. It sounded like a business launch. It sounded like something involving the money I had given them just 2 months earlier. $3.6 million. Everything I had built over 15 years of saving, equity loans, and the last portion of what my father had left for me. Money I believed would help Rachel's family keep their stores alive. Why was I not there for a partnership celebration that I had funded? I called Rachel. The call rang without answer. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. Maybe the music drowned it out. I told myself. But the lie barely held for more than a second. The live stream continued. People toasted. Someone shouted about new beginnings. Champagne sprayed across the screen. My name was never spoken and was never. A cold pressure built in my chest. Something was wrong. Not just wrong. Hidden. Structured. Planned without me. My hands shook as I grabbed my keys. I left the townhouse without turning off the lights. The cold air hit me hard when I stepped outside. But it felt cleaner than the air in that empty house. I got into my truck and started the engine. The sound steadied me a little. Richmond was 4 hours away if traffic cooperated. I had done the drive many times visiting her parents. Back then I felt nervous but hopeful. Trying to prove myself. Trying to be enough. Tonight the road felt endless as I pulled onto the highway. The live stream replayed in my mind again and again. Rachel smiling. Champagne I had paid for. A celebration I knew nothing about. My $3.6 million turning into someone else's new beginning. And not a single person had asked where I was. I pressed harder on the gas. The sky ahead was a deep winter black. And somewhere within that darkness, I sensed a truth waiting for me. A truth I could no longer ignore. I drove toward Richmond, the cold wind sliding through the cracked window, carrying the bitter taste of something I did not want to name yet. I kept driving until the lights of the city finally appeared on the horizon. And by then I already knew there was no going back. The closer I got to the Whitmore neighborhood, the brighter the streets became. Lined with perfect lawns and holiday lights wrapped around every tree like a reminder of a world I never quite fit into. My truck felt out of place rolling through those clean, curated streets. I parked near the end of the long driveway, the villa glowing ahead of me with warm light spilling from tall windows. My heartbeat kept pounding, steady and heavy, as if each step toward the house was making something inside me crack open a little more. I walked up the stone path and heard laughter before I even reached the front door. The kind of laughter that belonged to people who never had to worry about a bill or a shift schedule. The front door was propped open, which told me exactly what kind of night it was. Everyone was welcome, except me. Inside, the party seemed even bigger than what Tyler's live stream had shown. Dozens of well-dressed guests moved around the living room, carrying glasses of champagne. A band played in the corner. A massive tree shimmered. The smell of roasted meat and spiced wine filled the air. I stood there long enough that a few people noticed me and paused for a second, confusion passing over their faces. Then they drifted away, like I was just part of the background. I spotted Rachel near the center of the room. She was speaking with a group of her cousins, laughing, tossing her hair back the way she used to when she wanted attention. For a moment I watched her, thinking maybe she would sense me and come over. But when she finally saw me, her smile froze, then faded as she excused herself from the group. She walked toward me slowly, and the closer she got, the more I could see the annoyance in her eyes. Not guilt, not worry, annoyance. She stopped inches from me. Her voice was low but sharp. "Logan, you should not be here." I stared at her face, at the makeup, at the dress she clearly bought for an occasion she never mentioned to me. "Why didn't you invite me? Why didn't you answer the phone?" She looked around nervously as if embarrassed I might be overheard. "This is a small family gathering. It is not your kind of thing. I did not think you would want to come. My kind of thing." The phrase hit harder than she probably meant. I was still trying to swallow the sting when a familiar voice cut in from behind me. Logan Hartley. What a surprise. Charles Whitmore stepped forward holding a glass of champagne, dressed in a dark suit that probably cost more than my truck. His smile was polite but cold. He positioned himself between me and the rest of the room, like someone guarding the doorway to a private club. "Rachel did not invite you." This event is not open to the public. His eyes moved over my work jacket, my jeans, the boots still dusty from the shift I had barely finished. You understand how this looks? I could feel guests watching. Conversations dipped just enough that the room felt colder. I clenched my jaw. I came here to see my wife. Before Rachel could respond, Elaine appeared on Charles's other side. She wore a silk dress and a necklace so bright it almost hurt to look at. She folded her arms and looked me up and down. Logan, this night is important for our family. We don't have space for disruptions. Disruptions. That was what they thought I was. I held my hands at my sides, trying to stay grounded. I gave this family everything I had. Rachel stepped back slightly, her face tightening as if she feared what I might say next. But before I could speak, a burst of loud laughter erupted from behind us. Tyler had returned and, of course, he was filming again. He pointed the camera at me for a moment. The live stream audience blew up with comments. I caught a glimpse of my own face on the screen. Tired, out of place, humiliated. I stepped toward Rachel. Explain this partnership celebration. Why did I have to find out from a live stream? And tell me why your family used my money after promising you needed it to save your stores. Rachel looked away. Charles stepped in again, as if he had rehearsed this moment. You made a voluntary contribution. It was appreciated. But everything tonight is about the future of the Whitmore brand. You are not part of that future. The sentence silenced everything inside me. Not the room, not the music, just me. My voice came out lower than I intended. I gave you $3.6 million. That is not a contribution. That is my entire life. Elaine's expression hardened. You should consider it support for your wife's family. That is what husbands do. If you expected ownership or a seat at the table, you misunderstood entirely. Tyler laughed again behind the camera. A few people whispered. I felt heat rise in my neck, then in my face. And for a moment, I thought I might throw the nearest champagne glass across the room. Rachel finally spoke, but her voice was distant. Logan, you should go home. We can talk later. This is not the place. Not the place. As if there was any place left for me in her life. I turned away from them, not trusting myself to speak again. Everyone had gone back to their conversations, except a few who kept staring at me like I was some kind of sad spectacle. The kind of man who got left behind without ever realizing the ground was shifting beneath him. I walked out of the house into the cold Richmond air. The music and laughter spilled out behind me, as if mocking me with every step. My hands were shaking with something I could not name. Rage, hurt, shame, all of it blending together. I reached my truck and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I thought I might start the engine immediately. But instead, I sat there staring at the glowing windows of the villa. Inside those walls was a family that had taken everything I gave and still decided I did not belong. The cold from the night seeped into the truck as I tried to breathe. I didn't know what hurt more. Losing the money? Losing Rachel? Or losing the belief that any of it had ever meant something? I stayed there longer than I intended, watching the lights blur slightly as the anger in me slowly turned into something heavier. Eventually, I started the engine and pulled away from the curb. The road back toward the interstate was quiet, lined with houses that looked warm and safe. My life had never felt farther from that kind of safety. Just before I reached the main road, my phone vibrated with a notification. I glanced at the screen. It was a bank alert tied to the same account I had used to transfer the $3.6 million. A new message line appeared. Change in investment status. My chest tightened as I tapped the screen, and the truth waiting for me in that message tore through whatever numbness I had left. The alert opened into a short message from the bank stating that the Whitmore investment account tied to my transfer had been reclassified as high risk and that additional documents were pending review. I stared at the words until they blurred. High risk. Additional documents. That was not what Rachel or her parents had told me. They said the money was going towards stabilizing the boutiques, paying suppliers, keeping employees afloat during a rough season. Nothing about expansions or risky partnerships. Nothing about a new launch party. And certainly nothing about locking me out of decisions made with my own money. I sat in the truck with the cold pressing against the windows, and for a moment I let the anger turn into something quieter, a kind of heavy clarity. Whatever I thought this family was, whatever I believed marriage should be, I knew now that the Whitmores had never seen me as anything more than a source of convenience. I had lived in denial far longer than I cared to admit. The drive back to Charlotte felt longer than the drive out, even though the roads were almost empty. The holiday lights on the interstate exits flickered past like reminders of a season I no longer felt connected to. By the time I reached the state line, the exhaustion hit me like a wave. My eyes burned. My hands ached from gripping the wheel. A part of me wanted to sleep in the truck at a rest stop, but another part knew where I needed to be. Mom was awake when I knocked on her door in Wake Forest. The porch light came on slowly. Then the door opened and she stood there wrapped in a thick cardigan. Her gray hair pulled back the way she always did when she was working late on her woodcraft projects. She did not ask questions. She took one look at my face and stepped aside so I could come in. The warmth of her living room almost made me break down right there. The scent of cedar from her workshop mixed with the smell of coffee she had probably reheated twice. I sat on the couch while she closed the door and walked over to me. "Tell me what happened, Logan." Her voice was steady, soft. The kind of voice that had anchored me my entire life. I started talking, but the first words barely made it out. I had to stop and take a breath. Then I told her everything. The live stream, the party, the partnership banner, the way Charles and Elaine treated me, the way Rachel looked at me like I had trespassed into someone else's life. I told her about the $3.6 million, how the deal had changed without anyone telling me, how the bank alert felt like a final warning that I had been completely shut out. Mom sat beside me and listened without interrupting. That had always been her way. She would let you empty out the poison before she tried to offer any remedy. When I finally ran out of words, she reached for my hand and held it. "Logan, your heart has always been bigger than your wallet. You give because you believe in people. That is your strength, but it can also be your blind spot." I shook my head. I thought Rachel loved me. I thought her parents cared at least a little. Mom exhaled slowly and looked toward the window as if searching for the right thoughts. Sometimes people take advantage of kindness. Sometimes they mistake it for weakness. That does not make you weak. I leaned back and let her words settle. Her house had always had this strange power to make me feel like a kid again. Like I could reset my life if I stayed there long enough. But tonight, there was an edge of something else. A heaviness I could not shake. Mom walked to a small cabinet near the hallway and opened it carefully. She took out a thick envelope, yellowed at the corners. She carried it back with a look in her eyes that I had not seen before. Something mixed with pride and a little sadness. "There is something you need to know about your father." I sat up straighter. Dad had died 5 years earlier. I knew him as a hard-working truck driver who saved what he could and tried his best to give us a simple but steady life. We never talked much about money. He never acted like we had any. Mom handed me the envelope. Inside it were documents that looked older than I expected. Deeds for land outside Asheville. Notes about a rental property he had refurbished. Old brokerage statements showing small but steady purchases of tech stocks dating back to the early 2000s. Apple, Amazon, shares that must have cost him next to nothing back then. I looked at her confused. Mom, what is this? Your father was careful. He bought properties when the market dipped. He invested little by little. He never bragged because he did not want you to grow up thinking your life could be built on someone else's money. He told me to give you these when the time was right. I swallowed hard. How much did he leave? Mom hesitated, then sat down next to me again. The trust is now worth $8.4 million. He arranged it so you would receive access on your 40th birthday. He wanted you to have security and freedom, but only after you lived enough life to understand the value of both. For a moment, I could not even speak. $8.4 million. I felt dizzy. I thought about the years I spent scraping by, working double shifts, patching up old engines, trying to build something from nothing. And the whole time, my father had been silently building a legacy for me. Mom squeezed my hand. He believed in you, Logan. He always did. The weight of the past 24 hours caught up with me. I had never felt so betrayed by one family and so protected by another. My chest tightened as conflicting emotions pulled at me all at once. I felt grateful for my father and furious at myself. I wondered why I had given $3.6 million of my own hard-earned money to people who saw me as invisible, when my father had been saving every dollar out of love and hope. Mom rested her head lightly on my shoulder. You cannot stay in that house with Rachel. Not after this. You know that. I nodded. I had known it even before she said it. But hearing it aloud steadied something inside me. The unraveling of my marriage was no longer a fear. It was a fact. Mom stood up and told me I could stay in the guest room. She would make coffee in the morning, and we would figure things out together. Her voice had that steadying effect she always kept for difficult nights. I followed her down the hallway, feeling both broken and strangely relieved. I had finally stopped pretending. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of her old heating system and thinking of the life I had tied myself to. The Whitmores. Their perfect house. Their perfect image. Their perfect lies. I thought of Rachel's expression when she saw me at the party. Not shock, not guilt, just irritation. A truth settled in slowly. My marriage had been eroding long before tonight. I had been clinging to a version of Rachel that no longer existed. Maybe she never had. Sometime after 3 a.m, I finally drifted into a shallow sleep. But the last thought that ran through my mind was not about betrayal or money. It was a single question that tightened in my chest. If the people I loved saw me as nothing, what would I do now that I knew the truth? Morning light crept in through the guest room window, and for a moment I lay still, trying to remember where I was. The scent of coffee drifted in from the kitchen and reminded me that I was in my mother's house, not the place I had called home for years. My thoughts felt heavy and slow, but there was no denying the truth anymore. I had to go back to Charlotte and face whatever was waiting for me. Mom was at the table sipping coffee when I walked in. She gave me a tired smile and pushed a mug toward me. I sat down across from her. She never asked if I was ready to talk. She just waited, letting me feel safe enough to take the next step on my own. I finally told her that I needed to return to the townhouse and gather my things. Her eyes softened, but she nodded. She said she would be here when I came back. The drive from Wake Forest to Charlotte took less than 3 hours, but it felt like my body was moving through water. Every mile carried a weight I could not shake. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I sat still for a full minute. The townhouse looked the same as it had when I left it. Silent, cold. but everything inside would feel different now. I stepped inside and the emptiness hit me right away. Rachel was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone, legs crossed, looking bored, as if she had been waiting for me to show up simply so she could get it over with. She did not look surprised. She did not look hurt. She did not even look up right away. When she finally did, her face tightened with impatience. I told her I knew about the investment reclassification. I told her I knew the money had not gone where she said it would. She set her phone down and leaned back on the couch, acting like I was making her late for something. She said it was a business decision and that I should not interfere with her family's plans. As she spoke, I realized she was not explaining anything. She was dismissing me. I asked her directly if there was someone else. Her eyes flickered for just a moment. Then her expression turned sharp. She said that I had not been enough for a long time. She said that she deserved a life with someone who understood ambition and image and the pressures of being part of a successful family. She said she was tired of living with someone who came home smelling like oil and gasoline. Those words cut deeper than I expected. Not because they were cruel, but because they came so easily. As if she had rehearsed them. I walked past her toward the kitchen counter where a few envelopes were scattered. I recognized the receipt from a restaurant in downtown Richmond. The one I had found before. Lobster, wine, dessert for two. She saw what I was looking at and shrugged. She said it was just dinner with a friend. She said it did not matter now. I turned back to her, and for the first time saw her without the soft focus that love creates. She had already left our marriage long before tonight. I just had not accepted it. She stood up and walked to the bedroom. When she returned, she carried a stack of papers. She placed them on the coffee table with a deliberate motion, as if dropping the last piece of a puzzle. It was a divorce petition already signed on her end. She said it was simple. She said she wanted it done fast. She said we could both move on. My throat felt tight. I asked her why she had not talked to me before making this decision. She said there was nothing to talk about. She said our lives no longer matched. She said I should not make this harder than it had to be. I stepped outside for air. The cold morning breeze hit my face, waking me up in a way that felt almost painful. When I went back inside, she was packing a small bag, as if she feared I might change my mind and try to fix things. She told me I needed to be out of the townhouse within 72 hours. Her parents had put the house in her name, and she intended to reclaim it. My heart pounded with anger. But underneath it was something worse, a sense of foolishness. I had built my life around this woman, convinced she needed me, convinced the sacrifices were worth it. Not anymore. I moved through the house choosing what to take and what to leave. A few clothes, my tools, the photo of Dad on the day he bought his first truck, a small wooden box Mom had carved for me years ago. Everything else felt pointless now. As I packed, my phone buzzed again. A notification from a social media app. I opened it without thinking. It was Tyler's live stream replay. The clip had gone viral overnight. Comments mocked me, calling me clueless, calling me an outsider begging for attention at a party where I did not belong. Heat rose in my chest. My hands trembled. I shut the phone off and threw it into the toolbox. It rattled against the metal, but I did not pick it up again. I loaded my things into the truck. Rachel stood in the doorway, watching me with arms crossed. She said I would thank her one day for being honest. I looked at her and wondered how long she had been practicing that sentence. I drove away without looking back. The townhouse faded in the rearview mirror, and something tight in my chest loosened, replaced by a hollow space that did not feel like relief or grief, just emptiness. I headed north toward my mother's house again. The one place where the ground still felt stable under my feet. My mind kept circling the same painful questions, but none of them held any answers. An hour later, as I crossed into Wake County, the emptiness inside me began to shift into something sharper. Not anger. Not yet. Something else. A kind of awakening. A realization that everything I had believed about my marriage had been built on a foundation that had cracked long before the night in Richmond. I pulled into Mom's driveway and sat still, gripping the wheel. She opened the front door before I even got out. She must have been watching for me. I walked inside carrying only a bag and the wooden box Dad had carved. Mom looked at me with a sadness that felt like she already knew what had happened. She asked if I wanted to talk. I said not yet. She nodded, put a hand on my shoulder, and said that whatever I lost today, I had not lost myself. For the first time in years, I wondered if she might be right. I spent the next 2 days trying to settle my mind, helping Mom patch a loose gutter on the back porch and clearing out old lumber from her shed just to keep my hands busy. Every time I paused for even a second, the same questions came rushing back, circling like buzzards. How had I missed the signs? Why had I believed Rachel would fight for us? Why had I trusted her family with money that could have built an entirely different future for me? No matter how many times I replayed the past year, the answers never changed. I had wanted so badly to belong that I ignored every warning. On the third morning, Mom handed me a card from the kitchen counter. It was a business card for a civil attorney in Raleigh named Harper Reyes. She said that a neighbor recommended her and that it might help to at least understand what options I had. I did not feel hopeful, but I owed it to myself to find out if anything could be salvaged. The office was a remodeled house on a quiet street. Harper was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, calm, dressed in a dark suit that made her look both professional and grounded. She shook my hand firmly and asked me to start from the beginning. I told her everything. The money transfer, the promise Rachel made, the boutique debt, the sudden change in plans, the live stream, the humiliation, the bank alert, and finally the signed divorce papers waiting on the coffee table in Charlotte. She listened intently, taking notes, occasionally asking small clarifying questions. When I finished, she folded her hands and took a slow breath. Then she explained the part I had been afraid to hear. Because the transfer was voluntary and undocumented, legally speaking, the $3.6 million was gone. There was no loan agreement, no written contract, no record that the funds were meant to be temporary. Without that, the Whitmores were under no legal obligation to return anything. I stared at her, trying to absorb the weight of the truth. She added that even if I tried to argue misrepresentation or manipulation, the burden of proof would be extremely high. She went on to say that the boutiques were already flagged by the IRS for irregularities in their quarterly tax filings. That meant any money flowing in or out of their accounts was under scrutiny. If I tried to force anything now, I could end up tangled in a federal investigation with no guarantee of recovering a cent. It felt like a punch to the ribs. I rubbed my forehead and asked if there was anything at all, that could be done. She said the best thing I could do was protect myself from further exposure. Close any joint accounts, freeze any automatic transfers, document every interaction with Rachel and her parents, and do not, under any circumstance, sign anything they sent me without legal intake. I thanked her and left her office with a folder of notes that felt heavier than bricks. Outside, the winter air stung my face, grounding me. I realized I had been holding on to the hope that someone, anyone, might validate my sense that what they had done was wrong in more than just a moral way. But the law did not care about betrayal. It cared about contracts, and I had ignored that part. I drove back toward Wake Forest, but stopped at a small diner off Highway 401. I ordered a coffee and sat near the window watching the traffic pass. My mind kept drifting between grief and anger and a strange numbness. It took almost 20 minutes before I noticed my phone vibrating in my jacket pocket. It was a notification from the shared cloud account Rachel had never removed me from. An image backup had synced. I opened it reluctantly, expecting a random picture. Instead, a series of text screenshots appeared. Conversations between Rachel and Derek, messages full of private jokes, plans for trips, whispered complaints about me. And worse than anything, one thread where she told him she was tired of pretending and could not wait until her life was finally aligned with the right person. Every word felt like grit under my skin. Then I saw the final message she sent him the night of the Whitmore event. She wrote that the partnership launch was perfect and that soon everything would fall into place now that Logan was stepping aside. As if this was some polished performance she had orchestrated. I shut the phone off and dropped it onto the table. A waitress passed by and asked if I wanted a refill. I nodded, even though my stomach felt hollow. On the drive home, something shifted inside me. The humiliation I felt at the villa in Richmond. The way Charles looked at me like I was tracking dirt across his perfect floors. The cold dismissiveness in Rachel's voice. The way Tyler filmed me without hesitation. All of it gathered into a tight heat behind my ribs. For months I had swallowed their disrespect, believing marriage required patience. Believing loyalty meant holding on no matter how much it hurt. Now I understood just how misplaced that loyalty had been. When I pulled into Mom's driveway, she stepped outside before I even reached the porch. She asked how the meeting went. I told her it was worse than I expected. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and told me it was time to stop punishing myself. She said the person who takes advantage of a good heart is the one who should feel ashamed, not the one who trusted. That night I decided to make a list of everything I needed to rebuild. My finances, my living situation, my work, my sense of purpose. It felt overwhelming, but writing it down made it real. Dad's trust fund was not available yet, and I refused to depend on money I had not earned. I still had my tools, my experience, my work ethic, and the quiet determination that had carried me through every rough patch before this. I took on more repair calls around the neighborhood, fixing small engines, patching mufflers, tuning lawn equipment, anything to keep moving and bring in some income. It was not glamorous, but it made me feel steady again. People paid fairly. They thanked me. They appreciated the work. It was a simple kind of respect, the kind I had forgotten I deserved. A week later, while reorganizing a shelf in Mom's workshop, I found an old photo of Dad standing beside a rusty pickup he had rebuilt from the ground up. His hands were covered in grease, and he was smiling like the work itself was enough to make life feel right. I held that picture for a long time. I realized that the man in that photograph had known exactly who he was. I wanted to feel that again. I closed the workshop door and walked back toward the house, thinking about all the pieces of my life that had fallen apart. For the first time since the night in Richmond, the thought did not crush me. It felt like the beginning of something I had not yet defined. As I reached the porch, my phone buzzed again. An unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was familiar, strained, and filled with panic. It was Rachel. Her voice cracked as soon as I answered. She kept saying my name over and over until I finally told her to slow down. All I could make out was that something had gone wrong at the boutiques and that she needed help. She asked if she could come over. My first instinct was to hang up. But some part of me, maybe the part that had not caught up with reality yet, told her to calm down and explain what was happening. She said she could not talk on the phone. She was already in her car. I waited on the porch longer than I wanted to. The winter sun was starting to sink behind the trees, throwing long shadows across the yard. When her sedan finally pulled into the driveway, she stepped out looking nothing like the woman I saw at the Richmond party. Her makeup was smeared, her hair was pulled back in a way that looked rushed, and the confidence she usually carried like armor was nowhere in sight. She rushed toward me, but stopped when she got close enough to see my face. Something in my expression must have warned her to keep her distance. She hugged herself tightly and looked past me toward the house. She asked if we could talk inside. I told her we could talk right where we were. She took a shaky breath and said the boutiques had been hit with a federal audit. According to her, the IRS had found inconsistencies in the tax filings and wanted full records for the past 3 years. Suppliers had started pulling out, accounts were frozen. The expansion deal she bragged about was on hold. Everything was spiraling. She said her parents were panicking. I stood there listening without saying a word. She kept going, explaining that her father had put some documents in her name without telling her, that she did not understand half of what she had signed, and that federal investigators were asking questions she could not answer. She said Derek had vanished. His phone was disconnected and no one could find him. She was terrified, and she said she felt used and stupid. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She finally looked at me, and the panic in her eyes softened into something else. She asked if we could work things out. She said she had made mistakes and that she wanted to start over. She said she had been under pressure from her parents and that she lost sight of what mattered. She said I was the only stable thing in her life and that she needed me. Hearing those words felt unreal, like she had rehearsed them or borrowed them from someone else's apology. I asked her what exactly she wanted from me. She hesitated. Then she said she needed support while she figured out what to do. She asked if she could stay with me for a while. That was when I understood. She was not here for a marriage. She was here for shelter, for a place to land now that the family she chose over me was crumbling beneath her. I took a step back and shook my head. I told her she had made her choices long before any of this happened. She said she knew that and wanted to fix them. I asked her if she would have come to me if the boutiques had succeeded and the partnership launch had made her look like a rising star. She looked away and did not answer. That was the answer. She reached for my arm, but I pulled away. I told her I had nothing left to give her. Not money. Not a home. Not forgiveness she had not earned. She cried and said she was scared. I believed that part, but fear was not reason enough to walk back into the fire I had just escaped. Mom opened the door behind me and stood quietly, watching the scene without interrupting. Rachel wiped her cheeks and finally asked if I was throwing away years of marriage. I told her I was letting go of something that had died long before either of us admitted it. She froze for a moment, then walked back to her car with quick steps. Before she got in, she turned and said, "I would regret this." I did not respond. I watched her drive off until the sound of her engine faded into the evening air. Inside, Mom sat with me at the kitchen table. She did not give advice. She did not say, "I told you so." She placed a warm hand over mine and said I had done what needed to be done. I believed her more than I believed myself. That night I slept deeper than I expected. When I woke the next morning, I felt something unfamiliar in my chest. A quiet space where chaos had been sitting for months. Not peace, but the first step toward it. Over the following weeks, I stayed busy helping neighbors with repairs and taking small side jobs around town. The work grounded me. It reminded me of what I could control. I saved every dollar that came in, trying not to think about the fortune I had lost. I forced myself to live like a man starting from zero, even though I knew the trust fund from Dad waited out there like some distant shore I was not ready to step onto. Then one morning, a letter arrived from the law office that managed Dad's estate. It said a provision in his trust allowed early release of funds if certain conditions were met. The attorney wrote that due to my personal circumstances and financial hardship, the trustees had approved partial distribution effective immediately. My hands shook as I opened the attached statement. $8.4 million available. Now, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the numbers until they stopped looking real. I felt a rush of emotion that was equal parts grief and gratitude. Dad had done this quietly, secretly. He had known that life could take turns you never saw coming, and he had wanted me to be ready for them. Mom walked in and found me wiping my eyes. I showed her the letter. She smiled and hugged me tight. Her voice shook when she said Dad would be proud. I spent the next several days meeting with a financial advisor who helped me understand how to protect the money. He talked about risk, diversification, small business opportunities. I listened carefully, wanting to honor what Dad had built. I told him I wanted something practical, something honest, something I could grow with my own hands. A logistics and repair business that could start small and expand if I did it right. He said it was a solid plan. Over time, the idea started to take shape. A garage for engine repair, a small fleet of trucks for deliveries, a team of people who worked hard and treated customers fairly. A company named after the man who had saved every spare dollar for me. Hartley Transport and Repair. One afternoon, while reviewing building options, I received a message from an old acquaintance I had not seen in years. She said she heard I was back in town and wanted to talk. She had ideas for community programs and wondered if my new company might be involved. Her name was Maya Collins. I remembered her as the woman who had once fixed a flat tire in the parking lot of an old diner, while wearing work clothes that made her look like she could tackle anything. She had become a child therapist since then. Strong, thoughtful, grounded. Her message felt like sunlight after a long storm. I did not know it yet, but her timing would change everything. Her message stayed in my mind the rest of that afternoon. I read it twice, then a third time, surprised by how natural it felt to see her name again. I wrote back saying I would be in Raleigh the next day and we could meet for coffee if she was free. She replied within minutes and said she would like that. The following morning, I drove into the city feeling lighter than I had in months. Maya was already waiting at the small cafe near Moore Square when I walked in. She stood up when she saw me and smiled in a way that made everything else in the room quiet down. She looked almost exactly the same, maybe a little softer around the eyes, but steady in that calm way she had always carried herself. We talked for nearly 2 hours. She asked about Mom, asked about my work, asked how I was holding up. I told her pieces of the truth. Enough to be honest, but not enough to reopen wounds I was still trying to close. She did not push for more. She listened the way therapists do. But it did not feel clinical. It felt like someone who genuinely wanted to understand where I stood. She told me about her job at a youth center, the kids she counseled, the community projects they wanted to build. She said she reached out because she heard I was starting a business and wondered if I might be willing to partner on transportation for their programs. Something practical. Something that would help real families. Her sincerity hit me harder than I expected. After everything with the Whitmores, it felt strange to talk to someone who wanted nothing from me except mutual respect and shared purpose. As we walked out to the parking lot, she touched my arm lightly and said she was glad I came. That small gesture stayed with me long after I drove away. But the world I had left behind had not finished unraveling. Later that evening, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a man introduced himself as an investigator from the IRS who was trying to locate certain documents relating to the Whitmore boutiques. He said they were conducting a formal inquiry into potential tax evasion, misreported income, and fraudulent partnerships. He asked if I had knowledge of any financial transfers related to the business. I kept my tone steady and told him the truth. I had transferred money voluntarily to help the family avoid bankruptcy. I had not been informed of any structural changes or business deals. He thanked me and suggested I retain legal counsel just in case more questions came up. The call ended, but the tension in my chest did not. Word spread fast after that. By the next day, a local news site had published a short article about the investigation. The headline mentioned irregularities in boutique tax filings and newly discovered debts far larger than anyone expected. Employees were quoted anonymously saying they had been kept in the dark about layoffs and missing paychecks. Customers complained about unfulfilled orders and possible counterfeit merchandise. The Whitmores were finally facing the consequences they had spent years outrunning. I kept reading until one name appeared that made my jaw clench. Derek Cole. According to the report, he had been listed on several partnership documents. No one knew where he was. Investigators believed he might have left the state. I told Mom everything. She listened quietly, then shook her head as if she had always expected a storm like this to hit the Whitmore house eventually. A few days later, I drove past the boutiques on my way into Richmond for a meeting. Yellow tape marked the front doors. A legal notice from the IRS was posted on the glass. The inside looked dark and hollow, like a stage after the play had ended. As I walked back toward my truck, a familiar voice called my name. I turned and saw Rachel standing near the corner of the building. She looked thinner, tired, and almost unrecognizable from the woman who used to spend hours perfecting her appearance. She approached slowly, as if hoping I might walk away before she reached me. She said she needed to explain. She said she had been lied to by her father and Derek. She said she did not know the documents she signed were illegal. She told me she was facing charges for misfiled forms that carried her signature. She said the boutiques were likely finished and that suppliers were suing for unpaid invoices. I stayed silent because there was nothing I could add that reality had not already taught her. She kept trying to justify the past. She said she never meant to hurt me, that she got caught in something she did not understand, that she let pressure from her family change her into someone she barely recognized. She said she wished she could go back. Her voice cracked and she grabbed my sleeve. She asked if there was any chance we could rebuild our life together. She said she missed the stability I gave her, missed the way I loved her without conditions, missed having someone who believed in her. I pulled my arm away gently. I told her that the person she missed was a version of me that no longer existed. She looked confused, then wounded, then angry all at once. She asked if I was throwing away everything we had. I told her I was choosing myself for the first time in a long time. She started crying again. Real tears this time, not the kind she used when she wanted something from her parents. I did not feel satisfaction watching her break. I only felt tired. She finally asked the question I knew was coming. She asked if I could help her with legal expenses. I did not answer at first. When I finally spoke, my voice felt steadier than I expected. I told her that whatever happened next was between her and the people she chose to trust instead of me. She stared at me with wide, desperate eyes. Then she turned and walked away down the empty sidewalk. Her shoulders trembling, I knew that was the last time we would meet as anything more than two strangers with a long and painful history. Back home that night, I stepped into the garage that would soon be transformed into my company headquarters. The place smelled of dust and old wood, but I could picture it filled with tools, engines, and the sound of honest work. I stood in the center of the room, imagining the trucks lined up outside, the Hartley name on the sign above the door, the future that had felt impossible only weeks earlier. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Maya. She said she hoped my day had gone well and that she had found a few ideas for the community partnership we could discuss when I had time. For the first time in a long while, I felt something warm and steady inside me. Life was not finished with me yet. Not even close. Her message settled into my thoughts long after I closed the garage door for the night. I walked into the house feeling a calm I had not known in years. Mom was in the living room reading, the soft glow of the lamp warming the space. She looked up when I came in and smiled. A quiet, steady smile that always seemed to say everything would be all right. Over the next few months, the pieces of my new life took shape faster than I expected. The garage became a real workspace. I hired 2 mechanics I trusted and bought 3 used delivery trucks that still had good bones. I spent long days repairing engines, testing routes, and setting up contracts with small businesses around Wake County that needed reliable transport at prices they could actually afford. I named the company Hartley Transport and Repair. Seeing my father's name on the first invoice made something in my chest settle into place. Maya and I met more often. At first it was for business, planning routes for the youth center and trying to figure out how to build something sustainable. But over time, our conversations stretched into evenings. We talked about the kids she mentored, the lives they were trying to patch together, the families that had fallen apart, and the few that still held strong. She asked about my own childhood, about Dad, about the way life had changed so fast. I told her pieces of the story and found that it felt easier to breathe when she listened. She never treated me like a broken man. She treated me like someone who had survived something and still had more to give. 6 months after the Richmond fallout, the Whitmore story reached its inevitable end. I saw it first on a regional news broadcast while I was eating lunch in the shop. The headline mentioned federal charges, unpaid debts, and the full collapse of the boutique chain. Charles and Elaine had filed for bankruptcy. Their house in Richmond had been seized by the IRS for recovery penalties. Tyler had gone offline entirely after sponsors pulled out. The family that once looked down on me from marble floors and polished staircases had lost everything they once used to measure their worth. I felt no joy watching it happen, but I did feel closure. Later that week, I heard from a former co-worker of Rachel's that she had moved into a small apartment outside Petersburg and taken a job at a local salon. She was still dealing with legal trouble from the documents she had signed without reading. The man she once believed would elevate her life had not been seen since the investigation began. She was alone, patching together whatever pieces she had left. I did not hate her, but I no longer felt anything that tied me to the man she once knew. My own life kept growing in small but steady ways. Hartley Transport and Repair gained clients faster than I planned for. Word of mouth traveled through the county. People appreciated straightforward service and honest prices. I discovered that feeling of purpose again, the one I used to admire in my father's quiet determination. There were days I caught myself smiling in the middle of a job for no reason other than the simple fact that the work felt right. Mom spent her afternoons tending to the small garden behind the house and her evenings teasing me about how obvious it was that I liked Maya. Every time she said it, I tried to play it cool, but she was not wrong. Something about Maya was grounding, safe. She had a way of making the world feel a little less sharp. One night, she invited me to a community event at the youth center. Kids were presenting projects they had worked on for months. I watched her move through the room, guiding the younger ones, encouraging the older ones, making each child feel like someone worth believing in. I realized then what I'd been missing for so long. Kindness that did not carry an agenda. Strength that did not depend on status. A way of living that lifted others instead of stepping on them. When the event ended, she walked me to my truck. The air was warm and still. She stood there, looking at me with a softness that told me she understood more than I had said. She thanked me for helping with the center. I thanked her for trusting me. And then there was a silence that held more truth than any sentence could. I reached for her hand, and she let me. Her fingers tightened around mine. And in that simple gesture, I felt a door open to something new and good. As the years passed, our partnership grew into something steady and real. We built a life that felt honest, a home without conditions or expectations. A future shaped not by money, but by the strength of choosing each other day after day. When we finally married, it was a small ceremony on the Carolina coast. Just close friends and a handful of kids from the youth center who insisted on being there. Mom sat in the front row wiping tears and laughing at the same time. The waves rolled in behind us as Maya walked toward me, and every step she took felt like another piece falling into place. Not long after that, we welcomed a daughter. We named her Willa. She had Maya's calm eyes and my father's smile. And the first time I held her, I understood how much of life I still had not lived yet. She became a reminder that everything broken could still be rebuilt into something beautiful. Mom grew older with grace and quiet humor. She spent her last years surrounded by stories, laughter, and the family she once dreamed I might have. When she passed peacefully on a warm spring morning, she left behind a legacy of strength I carried with me every day. I scattered her ashes beside Dad's favorite lake, and for the first time in my life, I felt both of them with me in a way that did not fade. On quiet evenings, I sometimes stand outside the garage as the sun sets behind the pines, listening to the hum of the world settling down. I think about the man I was the night I drove to Richmond. A man begging for a place in a home that was never his. A man who believed loyalty meant staying even when he was being erased. A man who thought love grew from sacrifice alone. I am not that man anymore. Life taught me the hard way that you cannot force yourself into a world where you are not valued. You cannot give away everything you have and expect someone else to protect what you lost. But you can rise. You can rebuild. You can create something stronger than what was taken from you. If you made it to the end of my story, I hope it reminded you of your own strength. I hope it showed you that walking away from what breaks you is not failure. It is the first step toward becoming who you were meant to be. If you have lived through something like this, or if you are trying to climb out of it now, stay a little longer and share your story. You never know who might need to hear it next.